On the 11th day, she measured out the last of the cornmeal with a chipped tin ladle and did not tell the men it was the last, because a starving man who knows the bottom of the barrel stops eating with hope and starts eating with fear. She had learned that in 6 weeks. She had learned it the way she had learned most things that autumn, by watching what happened when no one thought she was paying attention. The frost had come early that year, biting down on the high desert scrub before the leaves had properly turned, and it would be 11 days before the river loosened its grip on the only crossing for 40 miles. But that morning belonged to a different reckoning. That morning, a locked door behind a storeroom would come open, and a man who had let others go hungry to protect his spring contracts would stand in front of 6 trappers and a woman he had once traded away like a sack of grain, and he would have no good answer for any of them. She did not know that yet, standing in the gray hour before dawn with her breath fogging above the ladle. What she knew was the weight of the pot in her hands, and the 6 men sleeping rough near the lean-to, and the way the youngest of them, a boy really, not yet 20, had started watching her with an attention she did not understand. 6 weeks earlier, in the flat brown light of early October, her brother had pulled the wagon up outside a low log building with a hand-painted sign that read, "Hallow Bend," and had not looked at her when he spoke. "2 coils of rope," he'd said, to the man standing in the doorway, "and we call the debt settled." The post owner had looked her over the way a man looks over a mule he isn't sure he wants. She remembered the smell of tallow and dust, the creak of the wagon wheel as her brother climbed back up onto the bench, the particular silence of a man who has decided something and will not be moved from it. She remembered that he did not say goodbye. He said, "She eats too much for what she carries." And then he was gone down the trail, and the dust took a long time to settle. She had stood there with her trunk at her feet, and the ladle, the one thing of her mother's she'd kept, tucked inside her apron, and she had understood, with a clarity that did not require tears, that she had just been priced. Rope, forgiveness of a debt, that was the sum of her. Now, 6 weeks later, with frost silvering the scrub grass and a hunting party stranded within sight of the post's chimney smoke, she stood over the last of the cornmeal and did the only thing she had ever been good at. She counted what there was. She decided who needed it most. She did not count herself among them. The cornmeal came to 9 cups, if she measured level and not heaping, and she measured level. 6 trappers, a post owner who ate whatever he pleased, whenever he pleased, and herself. She did the arithmetic the way her mother had taught her to do arithmetic that mattered, with a stick in the dirt, then twice more in her head to be sure the dirt hadn't lied. 9 cups. 11 days, if the ice held that long, and looking at the sky, she believed it would hold longer. She set the ladle against the sack and used it to portion instead of a cup, because the ladle did not waver, did not spill, did not care whose hand had held it before. It was chipped along one edge in a shape like a crescent moon, worn silver at the bowl from 30 years of stirring pots that had fed people who no longer needed feeding. She had carried it through 2 households and 1 wagon, and she trusted it the way she trusted nothing else standing. Outside, the frost had turned the scrub the color of old bone, and the wind came down off the ridge with a sound like something scraping the inside of a kettle. The hunting party had made a rough camp within sight of the chimney smoke, 6 men and their gear, and a string of pack animals gone thin in the ribs, because the river crossing 3 miles east had iced over in a single night, in a season that had no business producing ice yet. She had heard the post owner say, through the wall that separated the kitchen from his quarters, that it would break again in a week, maybe less, and that a week was nothing to men who called themselves hunters. She had also heard him say, more quietly, that the post's stores were spoken for. She did not know yet what that meant. She only knew what was in front of her. 9 cups of cornmeal, a side of salt pork gone hard as a doorstop, a sack of beans she had not yet counted, because counting it felt like admitting how little there was. She knew the scarred man who led the hunting party had not asked her name when he came to the door that morning, had only looked at the smoke rising from her chimney, and then at her, briefly, the way a man looks at a stove to judge if it will hold heat through the night. She had not minded the look. She had had worse. She set the beans on the scale next, and began again to count. 6 weeks earlier, the frost had not yet come, and the road into Hallow Bend was still soft enough to hold the print of a wagon wheel a full day after it passed. It was the 2nd of October. She remembered the date because her brother had said it aloud, twice, as though speaking it made the arrangement more binding than it already was. 2 coils of rope, hemp, new laid, hung from the post owner's hand like something he was proud of. Her brother had not looked at her when he took them. He had looked at the rope, turning one coil over to check the weave, the way a man checks a horse's teeth before he decides whether to trust the animal with his weight. The wind that day smelled of sage and wagon grease, and the particular dust that rises when 6 oxen and 4 wagons have been moving since dawn. She stood beside her trunk with her hands folded, because there was nothing else to do with them. Her brother's wife did not come out of the wagon to say goodbye. A niece she had fed and rocked and taught her letters to peered out once from beneath the canvas, and then was pulled back inside by a hand that was not unkind, only practical. "She eats more than her share," her brother said to the post owner, not to her, as though she were a mule being discussed for sale. "Always has. Since our mother passed, it's been worse." The post owner had said nothing to that. He had only counted the rope again, running his thumb along the fibers, and nodded once, which was apparently agreement enough for both men. Her brother took the debt paper from his coat, the one he owed the post owner from 2 winters back for flour and lamp oil, and watched it get torn in half. He folded the 2 pieces into his pocket as though they were worth keeping. Then he climbed back onto the wagon seat and did not look down at her again, not when the oxen leaned into the yoke, not when the wheels found their ruts and began to turn. She had one thing with her that was hers, and had been her mother's before that: a tin ladle, chipped along one edge from some argument with a cast-iron pot decades old, its handle worn smooth by hands that were not hers, but had shaped it for her all the same. She had carried it wrapped in a flour sack the entire way west. She did not cry when the wagon went. She had already done her crying, 3 nights running, into a blanket that smelled of horse and wood smoke, and there was none left in her for daylight. The post owner had looked at her only once that first evening, the way a man looks at an animal he has acquired and is not yet sure has any use. 6 weeks folded into the shape of a season before she noticed the folding. She scrubbed the post's single long table until the grain rose pale under her palms. She learned which barrel held good flour, and which held flour gone to weevil, learned the particular temper of the stove that scorched on the left side, if left untended, learned to stretch a pound of salt pork across 4 meals instead of 2. The post owner watched her work the way he watched his ledgers, without warmth, only the cold arithmetic of value received against cost incurred. He did not ask her name after the first week. He called her woman, the way he called the mule, mule. She kept the ladle on a nail by the stove, where she could reach it without looking. Each night she measured what remained against what the season would still demand, the way her mother had taught her before there was a wagon, before there was a brother willing to fold a torn debt paper into his pocket and ride west without turning his head. Then, on a morning that should have belonged to October's dying warmth, the water in the wash basin had a skin of ice on it, thin as paper, and she understood before anyone told her that the year had turned early and turned mean. On the 11th day of the frost, the river made a sound like something breaking that had wanted to break for a long time. She heard it from the storeroom, where she stood with the ladle in one hand and a lantern in the other, counting sacks of meal that should not have existed. Behind her, boots in the doorway, not the post owner's careful, unhurried tread, heavier, certain. She did not turn right away. 200 pounds, she said, to the dark, to the sacks, to whoever had come to find her there. Maybe more. Beans besides. Salt pork, he swore, was gone by the 4th day. "I counted the crates myself," the voice behind her said, low, unsurprised, though she could hear the surprise sitting underneath the calm of it like a held breath. Twice. She turned then. He filled the doorway the way weather fills a valley, without effort, simply by being large enough that there was no space left over. His coat was rimed white at the shoulders where the wind off the river had found him. His eyes went past her to the sacks stacked to the rafters, and something in his jaw moved once and went still. "He told your men there was nothing left past the venison," she said. I know what he told my men." Outside, the ice groaned again, a long, low complaint, water finding its way through a wound it had carried for 11 days. Somewhere past the wall, she could hear the others stirring, drawn by the sound of the river or by some instinct that trouble had finally found a shape. She set the ladle down on the nearest sack, deliberate, the way a person sets down a thing before they pick up something heavier. "Then I expect we ought to show them," she said. He did not answer her right away. He crossed to the nearest sack and cut the twine binding it with the knife from his belt, unhurried, as though he had all the time the frost had stolen from them. Cornmeal spilled pale across his palm. He let it run through his fingers back into the sack and looked at it the way a man looks at a debt finally proven in writing. 6 weeks of this, he said, not a question. Longer, maybe. She had found the ledger tucked behind the third crate that morning, dates going back to August, columns of a hand she recognized from every meal she had been told was the last of something. He kept 2 books, one for the company, one for himself. The door behind them filled with shapes, the youngest of the trappers first, breath fogging, eyes moving from the rafters to the 2 of them and back, before he said anything at all. He did not speak. He only stood there taking inventory of his own, the way she had taught herself to do, without meaning to teach anyone. She thought, distantly, of a morning 6 weeks earlier when her brother had counted rope instead of counting her. It had been the 2nd week of October then, the wagon still creaking with the weight of people who had decided she was weight they could not afford. Frost had not come yet. The ground had still held the last stubborn warmth of a dying summer, and she remembered the exact sound the coils made when they struck the post owner's counter, 2 dull thuds, final as a door closing. Her brother had not looked at her when he said it. Too much mouth to feed on a trail that thin. He had said it to the counter, to the rope, to anything that was not her face, and then he had climbed back onto the wagon and did not look back, and she had stood in the yard with her trunk and the ladle her mother had carried from a kitchen 3 states gone, and she had understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, that she would have to become useful enough that no one could do this to her twice. She had not known then what usefulness would cost, or what it would eventually be worth. Now the ledger sat open on the sack between them, its numbers plain as a confession, and the man who had spent 11 nights leaving a portion of his own ration by her sleeping pallet, without a word, stood reading it with the same stillness he brought to everything, patient, unblinking, the stillness of a man who had learned that most trouble reveals itself faster to those who wait than to those who chase it. "He'll say it was for spring contracts," she said. "He'll say a lot of things." He closed the ledger. "Doesn't change what's on the page." Behind them, more of the men had gathered in the doorway, drawn by the smell of grain and the sound of a silence that had gone on too long to be nothing. Someone would have to fetch the post owner now. Someone would have to make him stand in his own storeroom and look at what he had called empty. It was Eli who went to fetch him, because he was young enough that no one thought to stop him, and quiet enough that he had spent 11 days learning how to move through a room without disturbing what was in it. He returned with the post owner's collar askew and his suspenders half-buttoned, roused from a bunk where he had been sleeping through the very hour his stores were being counted. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes went to the ledger, then to the open sacks, then to the woman standing with the chipped ladle still hooked through her apron string, as if she had walked from the kitchen without thinking to set it down. "This room's for spring," he said. "Contracts already promised." "You had no right." 6 men near starved 40 paces from a full larder, the mountain man said. "Talk to me about rights." The post owner's mouth worked at that, searching for the shape of an argument, and finding instead only the smell of his own cornmeal filling the air between them. She thought, watching him, of the 6 weeks since her brother had ridden east with 2 coils of rope in his saddlebag, and no backward glance. She had stood in the yard that morning with her trunk at her feet, and understood, in the way one understands weather before it arrives, that she had become a debt paid rather than a sister kept. The post owner had looked her over the same way then, the way he was being looked at now, weighed and found wanting, though he had not known, that first cold morning, that the scale would ever turn. "I fed them out of what there was," she said. "You told me there was nothing more. There wasn't meant to be more. Not for them. For you then, Garrick said. For whatever you'd have made off it come thaw, while they were bones in the snow. No one in the doorway spoke. The trappers who had come to see what the silence meant stood now seeing exactly what it meant, and their faces did the arithmetic slowly. 11 days of half rations, of watching each other for the shake in a man's hands that meant he'd gone too long without, while 40 paces away sat flour enough to have fed them twice over. The post owner looked at the ledger as if it might yet be persuaded to say something else. It did not. Numbers did not soften for a man's comfort. She had learned that in her mother's kitchen long before she had learned it here, and she found some grim satisfaction in watching him learn it now, in front of witnesses, with the frost still thick enough on the window glass to prove how close the arithmetic had come to killing someone. Outside, the river ice groaned, a long, low crack traveling somewhere beneath the surface, the sound of something that had held too long finally beginning, however reluctantly, to give way. 6 weeks earlier, the arithmetic had gone the other way, and no one had stood in a doorway to call it wrong. Her brother had counted rope instead of flour. 2 coils, thick as a man's wrist, coiled tight and pale against the counter, and a ledger entry scratched through with the flat of a knife. Debt cleared. And he had not looked at her when he did it, only at the rope, as though the rope were the harder thing to leave behind. She remembered the cold that day too, though it had been October cold, not November cold, a thinner sort of cold, that came with wind instead of frost. She remembered the smell of the mules, tired and sour, and the particular way her brother's jaw had worked before he spoke, like a man chewing something he did not want to swallow. She eats too much for what she carries, he had told the post owner, not her, as if she were a crate to be weighed and found wanting. Trail's long yet, you'll get more use of her than I will. The post owner had looked her over then, the way he was looking at his ledger now, assessing, unmoved, already calculating what her labor might be worth against what her hunger might cost him. She had stood very still through it, the way she had learned to stand still through many things, and had not asked her brother to reconsider, because she had known, even then, with the wind pulling at her skirt and the mules shifting their feet in the mud, that asking would only make the leaving take longer. He had not looked back from the wagon seat. She had watched the canvas top of it shrink against the scrub until it was only a pale smudge and then nothing, and she had gone inside and found the ladle at the bottom of her trunk, the one thing she had thought to save when everything else was being divided up like meat off a carcass, and she had held it until her hand stopped shaking. She had not cried. She noted this now, standing in the doorway of the second storeroom with the frost still on the glass, and the ice groaning its long, slow complaint beneath the river, the way she had noted it then, not as triumph, only as fact, the same way she logged flour and salt pork, and the number of days a man could go without either before his hands began to shake. She had not cried when her brother left her for 2 coils of rope. She had only picked up the ladle and gone to see what there was to cook. The post owner shut the ledger now with a sound like a door closing on something already decided. "It changes nothing," he said. "The company will side with commerce. It always has." Behind her, she heard Garrick's breath go slow and even, the way it did before he moved. She did not step back from the doorway, though the sound of that ledger closing had the finality of a gavel. 6 weeks ago, she had learned what men meant when they said a thing changed nothing. They meant it changed nothing for them. She had learned it standing beside a wagon wheel with mud to her ankles, watching her brother count coils of rope into another man's hands, as though she were a debt line he was finally clearing. He had not looked at her twice. He had looked at the rope. She looked, now, at the shelves behind the locked door, sacks of cornmeal stacked to the rafters, tins of preserved beans in rows too neat to be accident, a whole side of salt pork hanging where the frost had not been permitted to touch it. Enough to have fed 6 starving men for 11 days without once counting a spoonful. Enough that no one need have gone to bed with a stomach folding on itself, that no boy need have shivered until his teeth found a rhythm of their own. She had rationed her own portion into a memory she would carry the rest of her life, and there had been no need for it. That was the part she could not swallow flat and factual the way she had swallowed everything else. Behind her, the trappers had gone quiet in the way men go quiet when they are deciding whether to be angry, and beside her, Garrick had gone still, in the way he went still, before deciding something with his hands instead of his mouth. She had watched him for 11 days now, and she knew the shape of his patience, the way she knew the weight of a full sack against her hip. She trusted it, though she could not yet say why. "The company," Garrick said, and his voice was not loud, "isn't here." "I am." The post owner's mouth worked once, the practiced smile of a man who sold goods for a living, finding no purchase on his face. "You'll say what you like out here," he said. "Come spring, it's paper that talks." "Then let it talk," Garrick said, "about a man who watched 6 of us go to bed hungry, with a full storeroom locked at his back." She saw the youngest trapper, the one who watched more than he spoke, step half a pace nearer the doorway, as though he meant to be counted among the witnesses whether asked or not. She thought of her brother again, briefly, the way one thinks of weather already past. He had wanted to be rid of a weight. This man beside her had spent 11 days quietly making sure she never carried too much of it alone, and had said nothing about it, not once, until now. The post owner's eyes moved from Garrick's face to hers, and something in them shifted. Not shame yet, but the first uneasy arithmetic of a man realizing his numbers no longer added up in his favor. 6 weeks earlier, the arithmetic had run the other way. She remembered the ledger book open on the counter, the post owner's finger tracing a column of numbers that meant nothing to her, but meant everything to him. 2 coils of rope, a debt struck through with a single stroke of ink, and her brother's hand, not shaking at all, as he signed his name beneath it. The wagon train had already begun to move when he told her. He did not look at her the whole time he spoke. He looked at the horizon, at the dust the other wagons kicked up, as if the leaving were already a thing that had happened to someone else, somewhere else, and he was only reporting it. "You eat more than your share of the trail, Odalise. This settles it clean." She had not argued. There had been nothing to argue with. A debt was a debt, and a mouth was a mouth, and she had learned long before that day that some accounts got settled with people instead of coin. She had watched the wagon shrink to a smear on the flat land, and then to nothing, and she had gone inside, because the wind had teeth in it even in October, and there was flour that needed sifting whether anyone had left her behind or not. The ladle had been in her apron pocket the whole time. She had not thought to check until that night, lying on a cot in the storeroom that smelled of tallow and mouse droppings, and finding it there against her hip, worn thin on one edge, from her mother's hand, and then her own. It was the only thing of the wagon that had come with her. Everything else had gone on without stopping. Now, in the doorway, with the frost still silvering the yard outside, and 6 men standing at her back like a jury that had already reached its verdict, she felt the ladle's weight in her pocket the way she had felt it that first night, a small, stubborn fact in a world that kept trying to prove she did not matter. The post owner's uneasy arithmetic was still turning behind his eyes. He looked past Garrick to her, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Hallow Bend, he did not look at her as inventory. "You've no standing here," he said, but the words came out thinner than before, reaching for a floor that was no longer beneath them. "She's fed 6 men, 11 days, on what you swore didn't exist," Garrick said. "That's standing enough." The youngest trapper shifted again near the door, and she caught the look he gave her. Not surprise, she realized, but something closer to confirmation, as though he had known this reckoning was coming, since the 3rd night, when he'd seen a portion of dried venison appear beside her pallet, with no hand attached to it. 6 weeks earlier, on the 3rd night of the frost, she had not known his name yet, only the shape of him against the fire, the widest set of shoulders she had ever fed, and the quietest. She had gone to sleep hungry, as she had every night since the counting began, and woken to find a strip of dried venison laid on the folded blanket beside her head, still faintly warm from a hand that had not stayed to be thanked. She had eaten it standing, in the dark, because to eat sitting felt like accepting something she had not yet understood was being given. She had told herself it was an accident of someone else's fullness. She had told herself that for 3 more nights, until the pattern refused to be anything but a pattern, and by then it was easier to let it happen than to name it and risk it stopping. She had not told him she knew. That was its own kind of ledger, kept in silence, the way she kept the food stores, down to the half cup, down to the smallest child's portion, because a woman who had been counted as a debt learned early that numbers did not lie even when people did. Now, in the doorway, the post owner's mouth opened and closed once before he found the next thing to say, and what he found was smaller than what had come before it. "The company will want the ledgers," he said, as if ledgers were a place to hide, as if a column of ink could argue against 6 men still standing upright, who should have been 6 frozen shapes under canvas by the 4th day. "They'll want to see the second storeroom," Garrick said, "and they'll want to know how full it was on the 9th, when she found it, against how full it is now." He did not raise his voice. He never had, not once in 11 days, and she understood suddenly that this too was a kind of ration, that he measured his words the way she measured cornmeal, giving only what was needed and never more. The youngest trapper stepped forward then, and it seemed to cost him something, the way it costs a young man something to speak in front of older men he has spent weeks learning to be quiet around. "I saw the meat go missing from his own plate," he said, not looking at Garrick, looking instead at the floorboards as though they might steady him. "More than once." "I didn't say nothing. Didn't seem like mine to say." The post owner's eyes moved from the boy to Garrick to her, and something in his face shifted from calculation to a slower, colder understanding. That the arithmetic he had built his life on, weighing debts and rope and flesh against each other, had never once accounted for the kind of accounting she had been doing all along. 6 weeks earlier, the arithmetic had been simpler, or so her brother had made it seem, standing beside the rope coils with his hat in his hands, like a man at a funeral for someone not yet dead. 2 coils, dun-colored, tightly wound, a debt of $11, forgiven. A sister, weighed against both, and found to be worth exactly their sum and no more. She had watched him load the wagon without her trunk at first, as though he had forgotten it, or hoped to, and when she reminded him, he had set it down hard enough that the tin ladle inside rattled against the wood like something trying to get out. He had not looked at her when he said the words about mouths and miles and what the trail could carry. He had looked at the horses instead, as if they might disagree with him and spare him the trouble of meaning it. She had stood at the door of the post and watched the wagon shrink into the scrub until it was only dust, and then not even that, and she had gone inside and found the kitchen, because a kitchen was the one room in any building where a woman's presence required no explanation. Now, in the lamplight of the storeroom made public, she felt something similar to that morning, the sense of being weighed by men who believed themselves qualified to do the weighing. The post owner's mouth opened and closed once before he found words. "The contracts," he said again, softer now, testing whether softness might succeed where volume had not. "Spring trade keeps this post running through the winter after. You'd have me give it all away on a frost that wasn't in any almanac." "Nobody's asking you to give it away," Garrick said. "Asking you to admit you had it. Asking these men to know what nearly killed them was sitting behind a locked door the whole while." The boy who had spoken was still looking at the floorboards, and she found she wanted to tell him it was all right, that speaking up did not make him less than the men who had waited, but she held the words back the way she had held back 100 meals meant for herself. Some things were not hers to spend either. The post owner's eyes came to rest on her last, and there was something almost like appeal in them, an old man's hope that the person he had least accounted for might be the one to let him off easiest. She met his look and did not soften it. She had spent 11 days learning exactly how much a portion was worth, and she was not inclined, now, to round down on his behalf. 6 weeks earlier, she had learned the same lesson from the other direction, standing in the yard with her trunk already unloaded and her brother refusing to look at her while he counted rope into a man's hands, as though the coils were the heavier burden between them. The debt had been $40, incurred over 2 winters of feed and shoeing, and the rope had been valued generously, she thought later, at 10. The rest of the ledger closed on her name. Nobody wrote it that way, but she had done the arithmetic herself, sitting on the trunk while the wagon pulled out of sight, and arithmetic did not require anyone's permission to be true. The post owner had looked her over that first day, the way a man looks at stock he suspects has been oversold to him. He had not been cruel about it, exactly. Cruelty would have required more attention than he gave her. He had shown her the kitchen, the storeroom, the pallet in the room off the back, and told her what was expected in the flat voice of a man reading out chores to a hired girl he did not intend to pay. She had nodded and gone to work, because there was nothing else on offer, and because she had already decided, somewhere in the 6 days it took her brother's wagon to reach Hallow Bend, that she would not be the one who arrived somewhere hungry and made herself smaller for it. She thought of that decision now, watching him fail to meet her eyes in front of 6 men who had nearly died believing his stores were empty. He had misjudged her twice. The first time, in October, he had looked at her size and assumed appetite, assumed a woman who ate more than she was worth. The second time, these 11 days past, he had looked at her competence and assumed it would be grateful, that a woman with so little claim on comfort would ration his food so carefully out of some natural loyalty to the man who fed her, rather than out of the plain fact that people were starving and someone needed to count. He had never once considered that the counting might be turned on him. "There were nights," she said, and her voice did not rise, "when I gave my own plate to a man shaking too hard to hold a spoon, and told myself it was one night, we'd manage. I did that 4 times. I have the tally in my head yet, same as I have the tally of every sack in your locked room." She let that sit. "You had enough behind that door to have spared me the trouble." The scarred man beside her said nothing, but she felt him shift his weight, the way a man does when he means to make room for someone to keep speaking. Kroll's mouth worked without sound, the way a man's does when the words he has ready no longer fit the moment he is standing in. He looked at the 6 trappers ranged behind her, at the young one whose eyes had gone flat and hard, in a way they had not been 6 weeks ago, and he understood, perhaps for the first time, that he was outnumbered not by bodies, but by witnesses. 6 weeks earlier, on the morning her brother had driven off, she had stood in the yard at Hallow Bend, with her trunk at her feet, and told herself the same thing 4 times. "One night, we'll manage." She had not known yet what manage would come to cost her, only that the wagon dust was already settling, and there was no one left on the road to call after. The post owner set his jaw. "Spring trade contracts," he said again, weaker now. A man repeating a password after the door has already opened. "Company stores. Not mine to give away on a hunch that the ice might not break." It wasn't a hunch, she said. It was arithmetic. She had done the arithmetic every night for 11 nights by the light of a tallow stub, the tin ladle beside her plate, measuring what little there was into portions too small to satisfy, and just large enough to keep a man's hands from shaking. She had not needed a locked door to tell her that 6 men and 1 post owner could not survive on what he claimed to have. The scarred man finally spoke, and his voice was low enough that the trappers leaned in to catch it. "You let us go hungry," he said, "while you had beans enough behind that wall to feed the post through till March." It was not a question. It was the kind of sentence a man says once he has already weighed the matter and reached his verdict, and only wants to hear it echo back at him before he acts on it. Kroll's eyes went to her, then to the trunk, still sitting near the storeroom door, where she had left it that morning, packed with the small, deliberate care of a woman who had learned not to trust that any place was hers to keep. "She's my hired help," he said, as if that settled ownership of blame, the way it had once settled ownership of her labor. "She was never your help," the scarred man said. "She was the only one here who fed 6 men before she fed herself." He turned to her, and something in his weathered face made the youngest trapper look away, embarrassed by whatever he thought he was seeing. "4 times," he said. "You said 4 times you gave your plate away." He did not phrase it as a question either. She met his eyes and did not look down, though every instinct from her brother's wagon told her to. "I lost count of how many times you gave me yours," she said. Something moved through the assembled men then, a shift like wind changing before weather, and Eli Marsh, the youngest, the one who had said nothing for 11 days, found his voice cracking out of him before he had decided to use it. "I saw him do it," he said. "3rd night. I saw him leave his plate by her pallet and walk off like it was nothing. Nobody had asked him to speak. That was the thing that gave it weight. A boy of 19 who had spent 11 days watching older men freeze and starve and measure out their pride in spoonfuls, and he had chosen this moment, in front of the post owner and the scarred man and the woman who had fed them all, to say the one true thing he had been carrying. Kroll's mouth opened, then closed. He looked between the boy and the trapper and the woman, as a man looks at a hand of cards he has already lost, calculating whether there remains some way to bluff a table that has already seen his cards face up. "A man can share his own food," Krull said. "That's no crime against me." "No," the scarred man agreed. "The crime against you is the one behind that second door." The word second dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and Krull's face did something Odalus had not seen it do in 6 weeks. Not anger, not the practiced condescension he wore like a coat he never removed, but something closer to fear, thin and sudden, a man watching the floor open beneath a house he had thought built on solid ground. She thought of the morning she had found that door, the rust on the hinge, the way it had given under her shoulder with a sound like something exhaling after a long time holding its breath. 40 pounds of cornmeal, 2 barrels of salt pork, beans enough to have fed the camp through the worst of it without anyone ever going without the counting, without the 4 plates she had given away, and the 4 times he had given his back. None of it needed to have happened at all if the man standing before her now had simply told the truth in October instead of November. She had not told the trappers that morning. She had told the scarred man, and only him, in the gray hour before the others woke, because she had wanted to see what he would do with a secret before she gave it to a room full of hungry men who might do something worse than expose it. He had said nothing then either. He had only nodded, once, the way a man nods when a thing he already suspected is finally confirmed, and told her to wait until the ice broke. Now the ice had broken. "Show them," he said to her, and did not look away from Krull as he said it. 6 weeks earlier, she had learned that a locked door in a small building tells you more than an open one ever will. She had noticed it on the second day of the frost, when the wind first found the seams of the walls, and she went looking for anything that might stretch a pot of beans further. A door behind the quarters, warped shut, its latch rusted in a way that suggested disuse rather than age. She had asked about it once. The post owner had told her it was a root cellar gone to rot, not worth the trouble of opening, and she had believed him the way a person believes a man who owns the roof over her head and the food under it, because there was nothing yet to make her do otherwise. She stepped forward now with the ladle still in her apron pocket, its handle worn smooth from 6 weeks of measuring what little there was, and she did not need it for this. She only needed the trappers to see her hands were empty of anything but the truth. She held up the key. It was small and ordinary, the kind of key that opens 100 doors on 100 trading posts between here and the mountains, and she had found it, on the 9th day, tucked behind a jar of preserved plums, that no one but a man hoarding for spring would have thought to hide. She had said nothing that day either. She had waited, the way the scarred man had waited, because a secret shown too early could be denied, and a secret shown at the right moment could not. The youngest trapper, the one who watched more than he spoke, shifted where he stood near the fire, and did not take his eyes off her face. He had seen the extra portion left by her palate 3 weeks running, and had never once asked where it came from, and she understood now, watching him watch her, that he had understood everything long before anyone had told him a word of it. "There is a second storeroom," she said, and her voice did not shake, though she had thought it might. "Behind his quarters, 40 pounds of cornmeal, salt pork, beans enough that none of us needed to have gone without." The room did not erupt. It went still, in the particular way a room goes still when men are doing arithmetic in their heads, counting the days, the portions, the mornings they had eaten thin broth and thanked a man for his generosity. The post owner's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, searching for the shape of a sentence that might undo what her 4 words had already done. "It was for spring," he said finally, "to no one and everyone. The company contracts. You don't understand how thin the margins run out here." No one answered him. The scarred man only turned, at last, and looked at her the way he had looked at her that gray hour before dawn, like a man confirming, again, that a thing he had already begun to trust was worth the trusting. 6 weeks earlier, she had learned to read a room the way she now read this one, by watching hands instead of mouths. Her brother's hands, that October morning, had not shaken when he took the 2 coils of rope from the post owner's grip. They had been steady, businesslike, the hands of a man closing an account. She remembered thinking, even then, that there was a mercy in his steadiness, A trembling hand might have meant he felt something. A steady one meant only that the matter was settled, and had perhaps been settled for miles before he ever said her name aloud to the man who now stood shrinking in the firelight, still searching for a sentence that would not come. The ladle had been in her apron pocket that morning too. It was in her hand now. She had not planned to hold it during the accounting. It had simply been there, the way it was always there, tucked against her hip, through 11 days of counting cornmeal by the cupful and broth by the ladleful, and something in her had reached for it the moment she opened her mouth to speak of the second storeroom, as if the tin itself might steady her voice better than her own resolve could. It had. She noticed that now, turning it once in her fingers while the post owner talked about margins and contracts to a room of men who had gone 11 days on rationed broth, believing there was nothing more to ration. The youngest trapper was watching the ladle too. He had a way of watching things that mattered before he understood why they mattered. She had seen him do it on the 4th day, when the scarred man left a heel of bread near her pallet and said nothing, and the boy's eyes had gone from the bread to the man's retreating back and stayed there a long moment, filing something away. He was filing something away now. She could see it in the set of his young face, in the way he did not look at the post owner at all, only at her, and then at the man beside her, as if measuring the distance between two people who had not yet said aloud what 11 days had already decided. "You'll want to inventory it proper," the scarred man said finally, and his voice broke the stillness the way a dropped tool breaks a silence in a barn. Plain, unceremonious, final. Every sack, every cup. Company men will ask when the thaw comes, and I mean for the count to match what he says now, not what he says in spring when it's convenient to remember different. The post owner's jaw worked. He did not answer. Outside, the river ice groaned again, a long, low complaint traveling up from the water like something waking that had been asleep too long, and she understood, holding the ladle against her palm, that whatever came next would not wait for the ice to finish deciding. 6 weeks earlier, the wagon had not even finished pulling away before she understood the shape of what had happened to her. The rope changed hands first. 2 coils, thick as a man's wrist, dropped into the bed of the wagon with a sound like something final being decided. Then the words, spoken flat, without heat, the way a man might note the weather, too much mouth to feed, debt cleared. She had stood in the yard of the post, with her trunk at her feet, and watched her brother's back grow smaller against the scrub, and she had not called after him, because calling after him would have meant believing he might turn around. The post owner had looked her over the way he looked over a mule he hadn't asked for. "Kitchen's through there," he'd said. "Storeroom's mine. You'll earn your keep or you won't eat it." She had earned her keep. She had learned the weight of every sack in that storeroom by lifting it, the sound of every barrel by knocking on its side, and she had done this quietly, the way she did most things, because quiet had kept her fed longer than asking ever had. Now, 11 days into the frost, she stood in that same storeroom, the hidden one, the one behind his quarters that he had sworn on his mother's grave did not exist, and understood that the ladle in her hand had been counting something all along that had nothing to do with cornmeal. The scarred man's voice pulled her back into the present cold. "You'll want to inventory it proper," he'd said, and the words had a second life in her now, folding backward into the 6 weeks that had brought her to this exact floor, this exact light through a cracked shutter, this exact tally of what a man would hide from starving mouths to protect a spring contract. She thought of the first night of the frost, when she had counted the venison strips twice, because she did not trust her own hunger to count honest. She thought of the third night, the one she hadn't understood yet, when she had found a folded portion of someone else's ration tucked near her palate, like a secret too plain to be a secret at all. She had not asked who left it. She had known, the way a person knows weather coming before the sky changes, by the stillness before it. The young trapper stood in the doorway now, saying nothing, watching the way he had watched for 11 days, quietly, thoroughly, the way she rationed beans. The post owner's hands were shaking, though the room was no colder than any other room in Hallow Bend that morning. "Every sack," the scarred man said again, softer this time, as if the second telling was for her rather than the post owner. "Every cup." Outside, the ice groaned once more, and somewhere beneath that long complaint, she heard the river remembering how to move. Krull's mouth opened and closed twice before words came, and when they came, they were small, the kind of words a man reaches for when the true ones have already condemned him. He said the sacks were counted for company men coming in spring, men with contracts and names on paper, men who mattered to a ledger somewhere far from this frost. He said it the way he had said everything since October, as if the saying of a thing made it so, as if a trading post could be run on the strength of his own account of himself. No one in the doorway moved to agree with him. She set the tin ladle down on the shelf beside the flour sacks, gently, the way she had learned to set down anything that mattered. 6 weeks it had ridden in her apron pocket, through counting and recounting, through the nights she'd portioned salt pork by lamplight while men slept thin and hollow-cheeked around a fire that could not warm them enough. It had measured beans for 6 starving trappers, and it had, without her quite intending it, measured something else too. Who ate? Who went without? Who noticed? The young trapper in the doorway shifted his weight, and she understood he was not there for Krull's benefit or even her own. He was there the way a man stands at the edge of a thing he has watched build for 11 days, waiting to see if it would finally be spoken aloud. "Every sack," the scarred man said a third time, and this time he was not looking at Krull at all. He was looking at the shelves behind him, the beans and cornmeal and dried venison stacked in quantities that made a mockery of the thin rations they had all just survived on. His jaw worked once, the scar along it pulling white, and she thought, not for the first time, that his anger did not sound like other men's. It sounded like something old settling into place, rather than something new catching fire. Krull's eyes moved to her then, and there was a flicker in them she recognized from October, from the morning her brother had counted rope coils instead of looking at her face. It was the look of a man, calculating what a woman was worth to him, and finding the number smaller than he needed it to be. She did not look away from it this time. Behind her, through the propped door, the river's voice kept changing, ice giving way to water in long, groaning intervals, as if the whole valley were finally exhaling something it had held too long. 6 weeks earlier, on the second morning of the frost, she had stood in the smaller storeroom with the tin ladle in her hand and done the arithmetic that Krull refused to do. 6 trappers, 1 post owner, herself. 11 days if the ice held that long, though nobody could say yet how long the ice would hold. She had measured cornmeal into a chipped bowl and known, the way a person knows weather in their joints, that the numbers on the shelf and the numbers in Krull's ledger did not agree. He had shown her the ledger once, early, waving it like a shield. 40 pounds of salt pork, he'd said. Enough beans to see the post through to April. She had written the true count on a scrap of paper and folded it into her apron, not trusting herself to remember it against her own hunger. Now the paper was gone, burned that first week for warmth she could not spare, but the numbers had stayed in her the way the ladle's weight had stayed in her hand, worn into muscle rather than memory. It was that old arithmetic that had led her, on the 9th day, to notice the second door behind Krull's quarters was cold in a different way than a door with nothing behind it. A door with nothing behind it did not need a lock that knew. In the present, in the doorway of the exposed storeroom, Krull's mouth opened and closed once before words came, and what came was not an apology, but an accounting, as if the numbers themselves could argue his case for him. "Spring contracts," he said again, weaker now than the first time he'd said it, the phrase already sounding used up. "A man has to think past the winter he's standing in." "A man does," Garrick said. "You thought past 6 men starving in it." Eli Marsh stood near the wall with the others, and she saw him watching not Krull's face but Garrick's hands, which had not moved toward the man at all, which hung open and still at his sides, the way they had hung still every night he'd set aside his portion of meat near her pallet without a word. It was the stillness, she thought, that made him frightening. A man who shouted could be reasoned with, waited out, forgiven his temper by morning. A man who went quiet like this had already finished deciding something, and there was no arguing with a decision already made. Krull looked once more at the shelves, as though counting them might still save him, and found that it would not. 6 weeks earlier, on the morning her brother's wagon pulled away from Hallow Bend, she had watched the dust settle over the ruts and thought that this, too, was a kind of accounting. A debt entered on one side of a ledger, forgiven on the other, and herself the sum that balanced it. Krull had not looked at her that day either. He had counted the rope instead, running his thumb along each coil, as if her worth might be hidden somewhere in the fiber, and finding none, had simply pointed her toward the kitchen and said the words that had become, in the weeks since, a kind of private measure she carried the way she carried the ladle. Too much mouth to feed on the trail. She had not cried in front of him. She had gone into the kitchen and taken inventory, because inventory was the only language she had ever been given that no one could argue with. Now, in the present, he still could not argue with it. The second storeroom stood open behind him, its door swung wide on a hinge that had not been oiled in the retelling of any lie he'd told, and the shelves inside spoke for themselves in a way his mouth had failed to. Sacks of cornmeal stacked 3 deep, salt pork enough to carry a company through a month, not a week. Dried apples in a barrel he had claimed, on the 4th day of the frost, did not exist. She had found it on the 9th day with her own hands, feeling along a wall that did not sit quite flush with the one beside it, and she had said nothing to Garrick until she was certain, because a woman who had been traded once for a coil of rope did not accuse a man of anything, without proof enough to bury the argument before it began. Krull's eyes moved from the shelves to the men, and from the men to her, and something in his face tried, briefly, for pity. Not for the trappers, not for what they had suffered, but for himself, for the position he had been caught standing in. "You'd have let them starve," Garrick said, and it was not a question. Krull did not answer that. He looked instead at the ladle in her hand, chipped and dark with years of use, as though it were the ladle that had exposed him and not the woman holding it, and in his silence, she heard something close to the sound a debt makes when it comes due at last, uninvited, and cannot be paid in rope. No one moved to fill the silence Krull left behind him. The trappers stood in their frost-stiffened coats with the smell of tallow and wood smoke still on them, and the youngest of them, the one who had watched more than he had spoken through 11 days of counting other men's rations, shifted his weight and looked, for the first time, directly at the post owner instead of at the 2 people who had brought him low. "I saw the portions," he said. His voice cracked on the second word, not from youth, but from the effort of speaking after so many days of silence. "Every night, I saw what she took and what she didn't. I saw what he left by her bedding." He did not look at the scarred man when he said it, out of some rough courtesy, but everyone understood who he meant. "You had the beans counted for spring trade while we were eating bark broth on the 8th day. I'll swear to that in front of the company man when he comes." It was not much. It was a boy's plain accounting, offered without heat, and it did more to Krull's face than the locked door had done. He had built his whole defense around numbers and contracts and the shape of obligation as he understood it, a post owner's arithmetic, where trappers were customers to be managed until spring, and a traded woman was a debt already settled. And here was a fact that could not be argued into a ledger column. 6 men had watched him choose his shelves over their lives, and one of them was young enough and honest enough to say so out loud. Krull's hand moved toward the doorframe as though he meant to lean on it, and did not. "You'll tell the company man what you like," he said, and his voice had gone thin, stripped of the authority it had carried for 6 weeks, over her wages and her worth. "I answer to them. Not to trappers, not to—" He stopped himself before the next word, but the pause did the work the word would have done, and she felt it land somewhere below her ribs, familiar as an old bruise touched again. She did not flinch this time. She had flinched in October, in a cold that had nothing to do with weather, when her brother's wagon rolled east without her, and Krull had looked her over like a crate delivered short of its manifest. She was not that woman standing in this doorway now, and the ladle in her hand had measured that difference out 1 meal at a time, though no scale on earth would have shown it. Garrick's eyes found hers across the room, and something passed between them that neither the boy nor Krull was meant to read. She set the ladle down on the shelf beside the flour barrel, not because she needed her hands free, but because she wanted him to watch her do it, slow, deliberate, the way she measured everything now. 6 weeks ago, she would have kept it clutched against her apron, like the last plank of a sinking raft. Now it could rest. Now it had proven what it was for. Eli shifted his weight by the door, and she remembered, the way memory comes sideways during a confrontation, arriving whole and uninvited, the 9th night, when he'd caught her counting sacks by lamplight and asked if she meant to tell Voss what she'd found behind the second door. She had told him not yet, not until she knew the count exact, down to the last measure of cornmeal, because a woman with an approximate number could be argued with, and a woman with an exact one could not. 41 pounds of salt pork, she said now, to Cruel, though her eyes stayed on the boy a moment longer than they needed to. 60 of dried venison, 3 sacks of beans I weighed myself, and cornmeal enough to have fed 6 men through the whole 11 days, without a single portion cut. She let the numbers sit in the room, the way frost sits on a window, spreading whether anyone wanted it to or not. You'll tell the company man that too, or I will. Kroll's mouth worked, and for a moment she thought he might laugh, the way frightened men sometimes do, a sound with no humor in it at all. He did not laugh. He looked instead at the trappers gathered loose around the doorway, thin-faced men who had eaten bark broth on the 6th day, and called it soup, because calling it anything else would have broken something in them, and she watched him understand, finally, that there was no version of this where their memory of the past 11 days worked in his favor. Garrick had not moved from where he stood, but something in his stillness had changed register, the way a held breath changes once the danger has passed, but before the exhale comes. He was watching her the way he'd watched her hand out the last of the beans on the 4th night, giving her portion to the trapper with the graying beard, because his hands had started shaking worse than the others. Not admiration exactly, something quieter and more permanent than that, something that had been accumulating in him one silent, rationed evening at a time, the way frost builds on a window pane, invisible at first, then suddenly, undeniably, covering the whole glass. Krull's hands went to the ledger on the counter, as if a column of numbers might still save him, as if 6 weeks of hoarded venison could be argued back into innocence with enough figures. No one moved to stop him from opening it. Eli Marsh stood nearest the door, and it was Eli who spoke first, his voice cracking the way a boy's does even after it has long finished changing, saying only that he had seen the second room's lock from outside a week before frost broke, had noticed the fresh scrape of a key where no rust had been, and had said nothing, because saying nothing was what a man did when he was the youngest, and did not yet know if his word counted for anything. He looked at Garrick when he said it. Garrick did not look back at him. He kept his eyes on Odalis, on the chipped ladle still hanging loose from her fist, its bowl catching the gray morning light through the doorway. She set it down on the counter between herself and Krull, deliberate, the small sound of tin against wood louder than it should have been, in a room where 6 half-starved men were holding their breath. Krull began again, about contracts, about the company men who would come in spring, expecting full measure, about obligations that existed on paper before any of them had walked in off the trail. He did not once say the word hungry. He did not once look at the men themselves, at the hollows under their eyes, or the way their coats hung loose off shoulders that had carried traps and rope with ease 6 weeks before. It was this, more than the locked door, more than the sacks of cornmeal stacked floor to ceiling behind it, that turned the room fully against him, not the hiding, which men might forgive in a hard season, but the refusal, even now, to see what the hiding had cost. The bearded trapper, the one whose hands had shaken worst, said only that he would remember this when the post company asked him for testimony, and that he suspected he would not be the only one asked. Krull's mouth opened and closed once more, and then he seemed to understand there was nothing left to argue toward, no ledger entry that would balance 11 days of bark broth against a locked room of plenty. Garrick crossed the room then, passed Krull without a glance, and stopped beside Odalis near the counter. He did not speak yet. He only looked down at the ladle, and then at her hands, chapped and small-boned around a task too large for them, and something in his face settled, the way ice settles once it has finally, fully, stopped moving. Outside, the ice had gone from the river sometime near midday, and the sound of it reached them through the walls of Hallow Bend, like something remembering how to breathe, a low, grinding crack, Then water finding its old voice again after 11 days of silence. The men heard it too. One by one they turned toward the window, toward the pale bar of light on the floor, and something in the room loosened that had been drawn tight since October. 6 weeks. That was all it had been, though it sat in her differently now, heavier and lighter both. Heavier for the counting of every scraped bowl, lighter for the fact that she had counted them right. Krull did not follow the trappers out when they filed toward the door to look at the water. He stood alone by the ledger he had kept so carefully, the one that recorded rope and debt and nothing at all of hunger, and no one thought to comfort him, and he did not ask to be comforted. Garrick still had not spoken. He picked up her trunk himself, the one thing of her own she had carried from the wagon besides the ladle, and he carried it out to the sledge the way he had once carried a haunch of deer over frozen ground, without asking, without setting it down to rest, as though the weight of it were simple and settled and not worth remarking on. She followed him into the cold. The frost had thinned at last. The air smelled of wet rope and turned earth, of something ending. "There's room," he said, when he had set the trunk down and tied it, "and food enough, for a woman who rations better than any man I've hunted beside." He did not say it kindly, exactly. He said it the way a man states a fact he has tested and found to hold. "Not for what happened to you," he added, after a moment, as if that piece mattered enough to be said separately. "For what you did after. 11 days. Her brother had not seen it in 6 weeks of watching her feed a family that called her burden. This man had seen it in 3 days of watching her set her spoon down first." She looked back once at the post, at Krull's shape small and diminished in the doorway, at the young trapper lifting a hand in something that was not quite a wave, and then she climbed up onto the sledge beside Garrick, the ladle still warm from her apron pocket against her palm. The runners caught the snow. The past 6 weeks, and this one long day, folded together behind them into a single track leading forward, and there was nothing more to measure now, no ration to stretch, only the mountains ahead, white and enormous, and, for the first time in a long while, not something she faced alone.